For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sheila Barradas. Today I'm with freelance journalist and writer Ufrieda Ho to discuss her book Paper Sons and Daughters, which looks at the history of the Chinese in South Africa. Welcome, Ufrieda. Thanks for joining us. Now, first of all, congratulations on Paper Sons and Daughters going into its second print. You must be very proud.
No, I'm very happy about it. I think it's been quite a rewarding response that people have responded to the book as well as they have. The amazing thing about the book is that I always say it's sort of been like the big hurrah for the small story, the story of the hidden, the people on the periphery and on the margins, that generation of shopkeepers, forfee men, who make up this really hidden community in our country.
Now, your book gives rare insight into the history of a Chinese immigrant living under apartheid. Could you give us a brief history of the Chinese in South Africa?
I believe the first connection they had with the continent was already as way back as the 1650s, arriving as slaves, convicts of then the Dutch East India Company. So I think the connection with Africa goes back quite a long time. Obviously, we've seen waves of immigration through the years. So more recently, it would have been people in my father's generation. Obviously, they arrived so there were some free Chinese from the people who arrived from the very early days. But people like my dad who arrived when China started collapsing and opening and people started leaving China, they would have arrived as stowaways. They were obviously the yellow peril, the geelgevaar, the unwanted yellow man for a place like South Africa. But I think people were arriving because China was just in total devastation, famine, poverty, flooding, bandits had overrun the country. And I think for decades, I think people were leaving, and they were always leaving for the Golden Mountains, so the San Franciscos, the Melbournes, and South Africa, Joburg, obviously. They call it Gamsan in Cantonese. And there were some people I spoke to actually, obviously it's people from the village, quite unsophisticated, illiterate, and they wouldn't know which Gold Mountain they were destined for. So some people would have got onto a ship as a stowaway and not even have known that they were heading to Melbourne or to San Francisco. They just knew they were leaving to a new world, maybe hopefully new opportunities, and that was it. So there were the people like my father who would have arrived, and I guess hence the title. Paper Sons and Daughters is really, it's because people had to buy their identities or borrow their identities. And there's a lady, before she died, we called her adopted granny, K-Ma, till she died, and she's actually not my granny. It's because she gave her family name to my father when he first arrived, so that he had an official paper. And I always thought Paper Sons and Daughter, we call it GJ in Cantonese, and I always thought it was a South African thing. We have quite unique South African, almost like bastardized words, the same way that we say robot and the Brits are confused. Yes. So we have a bit of with the Chinese language as well. I guess it's a regional, geographical thing that happens. And I found out actually that it happened in San Francisco at the turn of the last century. They had a big fire that wiped out one of the buildings that got razed to the ground was the registry building. So the Chinese migrants who were in San Francisco would go up there and say, but I arrived here with a sun, and there was no way to disprove it. So they now created a little slot for this phantom sun, hence Paper Son. So when newcomers arrived, they basically filled those slots regardless of whether they were actually that person's relative. So the title really comes from that. So a lot of people, I think, are paper sons and paper daughters or started their lives in this country that way. And
then, of course, there's that element of your father having to carry that paper saying that he was an upstanding citizen.
Sure. I think when I found that document, it's quite a horrific thing because, looking at it, it's so worn and it's old, and it's the way pieces of paper get that almost like a chamois kind of look, and the folds in it, and as I say in the book, it's like when you remove a dog collar from a dog, one that's been bound too tightly. Yes. And he carried it every day, and it's again someone else's say-so of where the Chinese fit in. Yes. And in this case, he's a gentleman of good standing or whatever, so that he doesn't get thrown off trains and he doesn't get harassed, and it's a standard issue piece of paper, which is really it's quite a shocking thing to find, and it's but it really speaks to our history, and I think the experiences of people who are migrants and who are on our edges of society. And just coming back to the Chinese, then obviously we have new Chinese coming in. In the 70s and the 80s, obviously the Taiwanese arrive in South Africa, and they are trading partners with the nationalist government, being a so-called pariah state as well themselves, being a breakaway state. They trade without the nationalist government, so they actually welcome here. So there was a lot of Taiwanese influx, and you'll see that sort of like in places like Newcastle, Queenstown, where they opened up factories, that sort of thing. And then by the 90s, we were going through our changes. By 94, that really cements this most recent wave of Chinese migrants. By 1998, our government decides to shore up its diplomatic ties with the People's Republic of China over Taiwan. So you'd see an exodus of the Taiwanese since 1998, and then the influx of the new Chinese, the Chinese nationals, who now make up quite a big part of the people that make up South Africa now, I guess.
Well, I suppose that brings me to my next question. In your book, you write that you grew up in two worlds made up of the mystical East and the reality of South Africa. Can you elaborate on that?
I think being the daughter of migrants, it's like it's quite a strange situation, because it's like by the time you in standard 6, you're the one, reading a letter from the bank for your parents. Your English surpasses theirs, and you speak Chinese at home, and you eat the foods of fermented tofu and like strange things that might seem strange to other people, when you go out and you order a birthday meal at a wimpy bar. It's these collisions of two worlds, but it's also the collision of ideals of what your parents want for you. Obviously I think migrant communities, perhaps for my parents, would have thought, you come to a place like South Africa, you hopefully make a fortune, build a life, and I think the first prize is always to go back. But that never happens. You meet someone, in my parents' case, they introduce, they get married, they have children, you have a family, and you end up staying. Now you're a South African. And suddenly the motherland is an imagined motherland or imagined home, and you really are far more boerewors and, than you are, noodles, But yet those things all sort of like inform your identity. So it really does become a straddling of two distinct worlds, and I think not always an easy thing. They do clash in certain places, because it becomes not value systems, but I think ideals that people have that now sort of don't mix that easily.
Well, one point in particular is forfee, which you talk about quite a lot in your book.
I think forfee, it's such a fascinating thing, because obviously I call it, part of these invisible economies that we have in this country. Forfee becomes a transaction of survival, really, for a lot of Chinese. And I think it was quite funny. A lot of people asked me, they said, did the community, how did they respond, especially when you discuss, forfeit as openly as I did? And I said, the thing is, it was time to really acknowledge why, and then contextualize it, and so people could understand the nature of forfeit, why it took place. And I mean, someone like my father would never have accessed mainstream professional life, or mainstream what was exclusively white wealth, essentially. Being a yellow man who was not going to access proper education or access to work that was exclusively for then white communities, or good jobs. And so forfeit becomes this really a metaphor for me, really of this division, because it takes place between two groups. It's literally the Chinese trading or transacting in the locations, the townships, these hidden spaces, once again, of our community. And when I actually ended up doing some anthropology research around forfeit, because I hadn't actually been back to banks since I was a child, and I said to the guy, I said, why does it still exist if there's lotto now? Because I can understand in the old days it was illegal because of the Calvinistic state, and it's gambling, it's associated with gambling, and maybe it can't be regulated and all that kind of stuff. So why does it still exist when there's lotto and casinos? And he said, take a look at the bets, Ufrieda. And they were 10 cents, 20 cents. So really people's lives are changed by a small bet. And I think that's quite a tragedy for me, that we still have people who are so poor that a 2.80 win that day actually means something.
Yeah, improves their life in some way.
Yeah, and it was precisely that. I mean, I think since this book, a lot of people have spoken to me about things like, I said, my granny actually raised us on the extras of forfeit. And those sort of memories, and I think it becomes a very sort of urban characteristic of a place like Johannesburg. And again, it's so uniquely South African because it needed those racial divisions. It needed, strangely, this kind of segregation. It needed the mutual collusion of two groups on the wrong side of white, but distinctly different as well, and distinctly separate within themselves as well. So I think forfee, for me, raising it in this book is really about giving voice to people like my dad, the generation of the forfee men, and understanding a little bit of what I think they went through, because it was such hard work. It was such sacrifice, the kind of work they did. And obviously, again, it's something that is associated with stigma, with shame, because it's not part of professional life. It's transacting with the poorest of the poor, the so-called polluted, the communities that are the townships and the locations. So, yeah, but I really actually, wanted to give voice to that, I think.
Well, deviating from your book a bit, the August 2007 publication of China Monitor argued that the Chinese living in South Africa, who appear to all intents and purposes to be Chinese, do not form a homogeneous community, nor are there strong inter-community connections. Do you agree with this statement, and if so, why?
I think it's quite obvious. I think no community really is homogeneous. I think we can't say that of any community. There are just so many variations. I mean, even with this book, I often say it's like I speak just for myself, really. I mean, my brothers and sisters would probably disagree with half the things I have opinions on. And so there are communities within communities. And I think that's the obvious way to look at something like the Chinese in South Africa. I think it would be really wrong to look at it as a homogenous group. But about the connections, I do think, though, that I would actually think that there are among the because of these waves of immigration, I think I would say that there are barriers. I do see a lot of bridges being built between the new Chinese, the established Chinese. But we have two Chinatowns in Joburg, which again stands as markers of two distinctly different groups. One, the established one in Commissioner Street, downtown Joburg. The established Chinese families like to call it First Chinatown. We put the mark on it. It's First Chinatown. We don't say Commissioner Street Chinatown. It's First Chinatown. So I think there you can see that there are those distinctions, but the distinctions really, I think, are for people to make the distinction rather than a separation, if that makes any sense. Because I think they are different, and a lot of people would want to say there are distinctions that we've got to acknowledge as well. But at the same time, I guess we are all Chinese, and some of the people would say they are first South Africans first, and others who would say they are Chinese first because they are Chinese nationals. So I think that distinction has its place as well. So.
Now, having said that, do you believe that the Chinese living in South Africa have finally been recognized with the end of apartheid? Or do they remain, as one writer put it, in an interstitial position of not quite belonging?
It's a very interesting thing, because you'll know that in 2008 the Chinese ended up in the High Court after a 9-year battle to have the definition of black economic empowerment, the two pieces of legislation of black economic empowerment and affirmative action. They fought that for 9 years because we were not included in that, even though the Chinese were classified as coloured before 1994. And so again, it was what it really raised was this thing of not black enough for some, not white enough for others. And eventually, I mean, it's as recent as 2008 that we end up having to use the device of the courts to try and answer this question, which is really crazy for me. I thought it was really crazy. But I must say, when that battle started, initially I'd said, why are the Chinese jumping on this bandwagon, the BEE bandwagon? Surely we've seen it fail. We know that it should at the very least have some kind of sunset clauses, some kind of needs-based criteria, that sort of thing. And then as this progressed and as I got more involved with the forums and speaking, I suddenly realized it was exactly for the community. It was about affirmation. It was not about the economic gain that would come from it. We right now are a community of about 10 to 12,000, the Chinese South Africans. It's a tiny, tiny number. So it really makes no dent on the BEE pie as I see it. And I think it was a validation when I was actually standing outside the High Court the day the ruling was made, and I saw people of my parents' generation crying. And I said, you don't cry like this for preferential shares. You cry like this because you're finally being affirmed. Your history, your suffering. And I remember one of the people in the older community said to me, he said, we have protected you, our children, from the worst of it. And it is true. And I think because it's again that sort of that migrant work ethic of you work hard, you protect, and you just education. I think it's those sort of like principles and tenets that they adhere to. And when I saw that after that 2008 ruling, it was really, I learned a big lesson out of that. But I think what was interesting was the backlash following that. I'm sure you will remember the Black Management Forum said they were going to appeal the ruling. And I think it was very interesting. I said it was the one time I really felt completely excluded from this country, that someone was once again determining whether I belonged. Never mind that I might pay tax or have been born here or whatever. It was again somebody deciding, like that piece of paper, like the gentleman of good standing, deciding where we fit in. And I think that for me was is still discussions that we have to have as a country. I think we don't have enough authentic conversations around belonging. I think that it becomes a very narrow. It's narrowing who belongs in this country, and I think we really should be having more authentic discussions so we can push those boundaries. So does belonging, is it reduced to political struggle credibility? Is it reduced to your skin color? Is it it's those sort of things, and I think that CV of belonging has to be broadened, and I think everybody who's committed to making a difference in this country, I think that is belonging. So I think with the Chinese, I do think that it is a question. It's I don't speak for all Chinese people, but I think it remains a question that people ask, and I think a lot of South Africans ask. And I wonder why we found ourselves in this position of people feeling excluded from a country that held such a big promise for every single person who is here and is making a difference, or at least contributing positively to the country.
Well, thank you very much, Ufrieda, for meeting with us. That was Ufrieda Ho speaking to Creamer Media about her book, Paper Sons and Daughters.